The VRAM explosion kinda happened overnight. For the most part, games of the late 2010s and even into the early 2020s could be quite happy with 6GB, even 4GB on board. These days, 8GB is almost mandatory in AAA games, making many of the high-end cards of the past now basically obsolete. All except, perhaps, this one. I wasn't that active in the enthusiast PC community in 2015, so I don't really remember what the feeling was about the Radeon R9 390 when it was released, as it was effectively a refresh of the R9 290 from 2 years earlier, now repositioned as a second-tier model behind the R9 Fury and Nano flagship cards. I can imagine that the extra 4GB of VRAM was largely a secondary concern. While I'm sure there were dissenting voices yelling into the void about how 8GB was the future, I'm equally sure that RAM quantity was less important to the average gamer than the $70 lower price point and higher clock speeds compared to the previous version. Now, of course, in 2024, those 2015 Nostradamuses have been proven quite correct, and VRAM is finally a major talking point. Over the last couple of years, game devs have been rolling out titles built around the 9th gen consoles with their 16GB unified memory pools. And while I'm sure there are ways those devs could have included some lower quality assets and smaller textures, that didn't happen. And so we're now in an era where 8GB is considered by many to be the minimum for 1080p gaming. And some would argue it's still not enough. Regardless, the reality of component shortages and rising costs around the world mean that 6 and even 4GB graphics cards are still being produced and marketed towards gamers. So even nearly a decade after its initial release, the R9 390 still stands out. The GCN2 architecture that the 390 was built upon received driver support for a surprisingly long time. Anyone who bought the initial launch of the Arch in 2013 in the form of the original R9 290, 290X or HD 7790 would have seen driver updates for 9 years, up until the summer of 2022. It was also the first of AMD's technologies to support DX12 features. Alongside support for asynchronous compute and Vulkan, this made for a surprisingly forward-looking GPU. And while some games in theory shouldn't even start due to outdated drivers, I hope to sidestep that problem thanks to RID, formerly known as Amername Zone, whose modded Radeon drivers have so far helped keep these aging GPUs relevant past the end of official support. Of course, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. The R9 390 has a monumental thirst for power, with the reference board's 275W TDP requiring both a 6 and 8-pin PCIe connection. This Sapphire Nitro model requires two 8-pin connectors, meaning potentially 300 watts from supplemental power alone. The test rig is, as usual, the moderately priced gaming PC, valued at around the £550 to £600 mark, featuring a Ryzen 5 7500F, 32GB of DDR5 6000, and an MSI B650 motherboard. If you're wondering whether an R9 390 is worth dusting off in 2024, or even worth buying, you shouldn't expect a modern CPU to have a major effect on performance, and we'll see similar numbers to these from any Ryzen 3s or better back to at least the 3000 series and Intel i7s as far back as the 6th gen. Many modern games do have issues with CPUs with fewer than 8 threads, so if you were thinking this might be an excuse to dig out your old i5 2500K build, you should probably think twice. Let's start with the bad news. The latest drivers available from RID apparently aren't new enough, as some games just flat out don't work. Alan Wake 2 crashes as soon as you try and look at the map, Starfield crashes after about 3 seconds, and Hellblade 2 only makes it to the menu screen. Now, you might say, so what? I don't like these games. And that's fine, you're entitled to your own wrong opinions on this stuff. Maybe some future version of the RID drivers for legacy GCN will fix this, but let's be honest, I think even with working drivers, the R9 390 would struggle to play these games anyway. In its original console incarnation, Horizon Forbidden West was actually intended to work on a form of GCN architecture, so I had high hopes for the R9 390, and it met them. Kinda. At 1080 medium, the average FPS is just 39, which, on reflection, is a perfectly console-like experience, and should be quite playable, all things considered. What disappointed me was that dropping to low settings only gained a couple of frames, and the trade-off is that the game looks like absolute trash now, despite using almost 4GB of VRAM. FSR delivers a fair amount of ghosting, so in my opinion 1080 medium, or maybe a lower output resolution altogether, seems like the best option. In the wake of the FX series Shogun, I've been looking forward to this one. Ghosts of Tsushima is a recent PC port of another previous-gen PlayStation game, so it's not really a surprise that the 390 delivers similar results as it did in Horizon Forbidden West. At 1080 medium with textures pushed to high, the average is just above 40 FPS and lows are in the mid-30s. And things look fine, actually. Maybe if I did a detailed DF-style breakdown of quality settings, I could point out areas where this looks worse than at high settings. But if you can live with a 30 to 40 FPS experience, and aren't looking too closely, this isn't half bad. Helldivers II is very much intended for current-gen platforms, so can be surprisingly heavy. To get the kind of frame rates a fast-paced action game demands, you'll want to drop settings a lot. I found that 1080 low with balanced upscaling was needed to keep things close to a 60 average, though it could dip into the 50s at times. There are obviously upscaling options below this that you could try, but I wouldn't want to go much lower than this, as this upscaling isn't much to look at. I wasn't expecting much from Avatar. It's a game with RT woven into the settings in a way that makes it clear the devs think everyone should have an RT-capable graphics card by now, and it has upscaling enabled by default. You have to drop to the medium preset and upscaling down to balanced in order to hit 30 FPS, and that's just the average. Lows are way down in the 20s. On the other hand, if you're the sort of person who doesn't care about graphics and just wants to enjoy Avatar Frontiers of Pandora for the gameplay, alright, you can drop to low and get a locked 30 FPS, but any further than that is going to require reducing to 720p as well as using performance upscaling, and that's just going to be a mess. The Resident Evil 4 remake runs on Capcom's RE engine, which has proven to be quite scalable and performs well on lower-end GPUs. However, it's also quite possible for those with limited amounts of VRAM to be stuck playing at low quality settings, even though it could hypothetically handle higher ones. The 390 has just enough VRAM to handle the graphics priority preset at 1080p, though not without making a small adjustment to the texture quality. I found the 3GB setting was fine, and that allowed for a quite playable average FPS of 45 with lows of 39. Dropping to the performance priority setting can give a far smoother 79 FPS, with lows staying above the 60 mark, and this time the 3GB texture setting is actually an upgrade. The Last of Us finds itself in a similar position to RE4, though this time I started with the higher settings, as I feel like that's half the point of looking at an 8GB card from this era. The game actually crashed halfway through my 1080 high settings run, and I don't know if that's due to the outdated drivers or the settings. However, I found that dropping to medium with texture settings bumped up to high completed the test area at an average of 36 FPS, with only 1 or 2 frame time spikes to spoil the experience. Normally, running modern games on older or low-spec hardware can be helped with upscaling. However, experience has taught me 2 things about Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. 1, it still looks great at the medium preset, and 2, it looks terrible with FSR. XeSS may improve things, especially the new version that's being implemented, but for now it doesn't help with performance much, if at all, so I tested at native 1080p with medium settings. The average of 36 FPS is pretty decent, but some of the crowd scenes cause some big drops in performance, hence the 1% lows are in the bottom 20s. Given GCN2's history as one of the longest serving architectures, and also given that Cyberpunk 2077 is now pushing 4 years old, it's no surprise to say that I've looked at this before. Well, the 290 anyway, and the 8GB frame buffer doesn't give us all that much extra to work with. 1080 medium still looks great, though the 1% scores do dip below the 30 mark in busier areas, and if you're pairing this with a weaker CPU, you might find some parts of Night City make things even worse. In my R9 290 video from 2022, it actually scored a couple of frames higher, though not enough to make a major difference, and it might just have been down to run-to-run variance, or perhaps something to do with the drivers. I've been here before too. Forza Horizon 5 has a small glitch when using some older architectures, whereby car decals and 2D audience sprites develop a black border in place of the alpha channel, so stuff like license plates become unreadable. This can be avoided by adding TAA for some reason, and the performance impact isn't as bad as you'd think. At 1080 high with FXAA, the game runs at 41 FPS on average, and the black borders are a problem. With TAA, the average drops to 39, but the borders are gone, and so are the jaggies. Again, this is slightly worse than the 290 I tested last time, but that could be from the fact that I don't take the benchmark's word for it anymore, and these days I use Afterburner's frame counter instead. Finally, Call of Duty Warzone. Yes, I skipped Fortnite. Sorry, I'm kind of fed up of it right now. Warzone can deliver almost 70 FPS at 1080 basic, which is not only pretty impressive in its own right, it actually far outperforms both the Intel Arc A380 and GTX 1650, neither of which can hit 60 at the same settings. I still wouldn't call it competitive. I played a fair amount of high FPS Warzone for my 180Hz monitor review, and it's ruined lower performance GPUs for me. As much as I want GCN2 to still be a viable option in 2024, the world is conspiring against it. The lack of driver availability is only going to make things worse as new games come out, and even modded drivers apparently can't fully solve that problem. In games that still work, the 390 performs pretty well, slightly better than an Intel Arc A380, and only about 30% behind a newer Radeon like the RX 5500. But performance alone can't save it. Power consumption is frankly horrific. I was seeing similar numbers to the RX 6900 XT, and given the availability of cheap RX 580s and good deals on higher tier cards like the Vega 56 and GTX 1070, you can get a hell of a lot more performance than this on the used market in 2024. Don't let the 8GB frame buffer fool you. This card isn't worth paying a premium for over the R9 290 or 290X. And, in my opinion, they're not worth more than about 30 quid these days. If you have a 390 or 390X and want to use this in the latest games, maybe it's time to switch. And I have the perfect recommendation on screen now. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.